Today we're looking at the chevron stitch, the diagonal stitch and zigzags that use only knits and purls. In this video, I'll begin by showing you the stitch patterns from basic to more complex variations. Then I'll highlight some characteristics about this diagonal family of stitch patterns that make them awesome. Lastly, I'll discuss the resulting fabric, project ideas and what to look out for, and show some examples of projects that I've made that use stitches in the diagonal family. What's common for all reversible stitches is that, of course, they look great on both sides and don't have a wrong side. Reversible knitting lies flat and doesn't curl, and the structure and texture are awesome. The diagonal family of stitch patterns all create diagonal stripes in the fabric by shifting short ribbing, such as 2 knits and 2 purls, in one direction for a section of the fabric. A large variety of patterns can be created by changing the width, frequency, and direction of the shift. Let's first look at a diagram for a basic 2 knit, 2 purl diagonal. The pattern begins the same as ribs, for example, a multiple of 2 knits and 2 purls. For each row, the placement of knit-looking stitches and purl-looking stitches shifts. For basic diagonals, it's in the same direction for the entire pattern. Notice how the stitches disappear as they fall off the left edge and appear on the right edge. Remember, the diagram indicates what the fabric will look like on this side. So if you are following the diagram while you knit, for rows knit in this direction, you are working on the other side of the fabric, and a knit stitch looks like a purl stitch on this side, and vice versa. So knit, purl, purl, knit. I find reading your knitting as you knit is relatively easy for diagonal stitches, and actually much easier than reading the diagram. As you're working in this direction, make one more stitch of the kind you're on than the row below. As you work on the other side of the fabric, the key to remember is that the direction of the diagonal is opposite. As you can see, on this side of the paper, the diagonals lean left. When I turn the paper over, the diagonals now lean right. So, in the other direction, make one fewer stitch than what's on the row below. The change in direction of the stripes is very important to take into consideration for some reversible projects. More on that a bit later. For basic diagonal stitch pattern, the stitches on the needle will keep the 2 knit, 2 purl repetition, except for the beginning and the end. I'll also point it out in the swatch. For diagonal stitches, diagrams provide a clear view of the resulting pattern on the fabric. The pattern can, of course, be written out as well. For this basic 2 knit, 2 purl diagonal, it's a 4 stitch, 4 row repeat, usually written like this. Feel free to pause the video to take a longer look. Before we move on to variations, let's look at a swatch so far. Here's a swatch of the basic 2 knit, 2 purl diagonal stitch pattern. You can see on the needle the 2 knit, 2 purl pattern repetition, as I mentioned before. You can see I have finished with a single knit. The next row starts with purl 2. Note that you can see where the knit-looking stitches sometimes sit behind and are sometimes pushed forward by the purl-looking stitches. I discussed this in more detail in the last video on linked in the description. This makes the texture of the fabric more interesting and variable, and dare I say awesome? Let's consider some variations to the 2 knit, 2 purl diagonal stitch pattern. First, you can easily make the stripes wider by starting with 3 knit, 3 purl, or 4 knit, 4 purl, or whatever matches your vision. Here's a diagram for 4 knit, 4 purl. Notice that with a 1 stitch shift for each row, the number of, say, knit-looking stitches in a row is the same as the number of stacked knit-looking stitches in the fabric. In this case, 4 stitches and 4 rows. I'll show a project with an example of this exact stitch pattern. Another variation is to make the slope of the stripes steeper or shallower. If you want the stripes steeper, then you can shift the stitches less often, for example, every other row. If you're reading your knitting as you work, you will look at stitches a few rows below where you're working as a guide. If you want shallower, then you can shift more stitches for each row. For example, shift the stitches over 2 spots in each row. If you're reading your knitting as you work, you will look further ahead or back on the needles as a guide. Regardless of how steep or shallow the slope of the diagonals are, you will have the same repetition of knits and purls on the needle, except for at the beginning and the end of the rows. A cautionary note: it is tempting to use a 1 knit, 1 purl repeat to get very narrow stripes. However, 1 knit, 1 purl shifting by 1 stitch each row is actually moss stitch, and 1 stitch shifting every other row is Irish moss stitch, which also has more of a checkerboard pattern. The key is for the knit-looking stitches to have a continuous connection along the row and across the rows. Likewise, shifting 2 knit, 2 purl diagonal over 2 rows and 2 stitches will also result in a checkerboard pattern like this red shawl behind me. I'll make a video of this stitch pattern family in the future. So now that we understand the basic diagonal, let's apply that to make a chevron stitch pattern. Generally speaking, this chevron looks like a big V. This is achieved by shifting the stitches away from the middle. Let's look at a diagram and discuss variations. So instead of all the stitches shifting in the same direction, the stitches to the right of the middle shift right, and those to the left shift left. Note that the number of stitches of the same type, knits or purls, in the middle of the work varies depending on where you are in the pattern, just like the ends on the diagonal patterns. You can make the stripes wider and steeper or shallower using the same approach as with diagonals. Reading your knitting is also easy. In fact, it's easier than diagonal, because the direction of the shift is the same on both sides of the fabric. Adding a stitch marker in the middle of the pattern may help you remember to adjust the direction of the shift. Here's a swatch of 3 knit, 3 purl chevron. You can see here in the middle the triple knit purl sequence is broken because of the point of the V. Rather than appearing on one side of the fabric and falling off the edge on the other, stitches grow in the middle and fall off both edges. Here's a new stripe just forming. This variation is quite wavy in a similar way and for the same reason as the dune stitch from my previous video. Zigzags work the same as diagonal and chevron, but it's a bit more complicated. First of all, you can zig and zag in 2 ways, horizontally or vertically. Let's look at the diagrams for each. For horizontal zigzags, you work several chevrons serially. The very outside legs of the V's fall off the edges, and the center stitches merge into each other. For vertical zigzags, you work several rows of diagonals slanting in one direction, and then several rows slanting in the other. Depending on the effect you want to achieve, you can choose how many rows to work in each direction. Generally speaking, wider stripes and longer diagonal sections create a pattern that can be seen more clearly. The knitting is easier to read as well, as long as you can keep track of the number of rows before you change direction. So what's so awesome about diagonals and chevrons and zigzags? As I have shown, there is an endless variation to match your creativity. You can even combine these stitches with other stitch patterns. For example, you can include moss stitch as a stripe, so it's a 3-textured diagonal. I suggest in this case that you use wider stripes, 4 knit, 4 purl, or larger, so the 3 fabric segments stand out from each other, as the pattern may get a bit lost. You can also combine a chevron in the middle of the fabric with dune stitch at the edges, so you get a V with wings. I can go on and on. I'll link my videos on exploring moss stitch and exploring dune stitch in the description. Of course, the more complex you make your stitch pattern, the more you have to pay attention. Let me know in the comments if you have more ideas on variations based on the diagonal family of stitch patterns. Another awesome characteristic is the number of rows in the repeat. With some planning, you can reduce the number of different rows. Feel free to pause the video to take a longer look. For the 2 knit, 2 purl diagonal, adding 1 stitch to the end makes it so row 1 and row 2 are the same, and row 3 and row 4 are the same. Similarly, for the 3 knit, 3 purl diagonal, adding 1 stitch to the end make row 1 and row 2 the same, row 4 and row 5 the same, and, interestingly, row 3 and row 6. The 3 knit, 3 purl chevron becomes a 3-row repeat, naturally reversible. So what awesome projects can you make with the endless variety of diagonal stitch patterns? So many possibilities. If you like asymmetry in your projects, you can try positioning the point of the V in the chevron pattern to one side of the middle, so one leg of the V is longer than the other, like a check mark. Or changing the slope of the diagonals for different parts of your work, or both, of course. One interesting idea I've been playing with to emphasize the stitch design is casting on just a few stitches and increasing to the full width of the scarf, rather than making a square end. Here's a very short swatch with a 2-knit, 2-purl chevron to demonstrate the idea. I think it has potential. Let me know what you think in the comments. For the diagonal family of stitches, you do need to plan out your work so you don't get a surprise. For more complex constructions, like an infinity scarf or Mobius worked lengthwise, you need to ensure that the pattern at the ends match up. More specifically, that your last row is one row in the pattern before the start of your work, so you can use the missing row to graft it together. My preferred method to use is a double-sided cast-on to make grafting easier. A cautionary note about Mobius projects. Chevrons and zigzags can be used for lengthwise Mobius construction with some planning, but basic diagonals should not be. As I mentioned earlier, the diagonal stripes do not lean the same way from one side of the fabric to the other, so there will be a very clear change at the connection that will be extremely noticeable. I'll be making more in-depth videos about reversible projects, including Mobius designs, in the future. Here are some more simple projects that I've made. Here's a large scarf I made for my husband many years ago. I have two examples of projects with chevron stitch. The first is a section of the oversized sampler scarf I have shown sections of before. Check out my short if you want to see the whole scarf. This section uses 3-knit, 3-purl symmetrical chevron stitch. I like how the blue color pairs with the chevron patterns, a bit like denim. The last project I want to show you is this striped scarf. I chose a chevron stitch pattern, a narrow width, and slightly modeled self-striping yarn to work together. I'm quite happy with the result. Let me know in the comments if you agree. So what's next? I've shown you some examples of how awesome the diagonal family of stitches is. Please feel free to share in the comments if you've been inspired to create your own projects and which variation you like best. For the next video, we'll be looking at a variety of reversible slip stitch ribs that I developed myself. It will be my first exclusive patterns video. So pick up your knitting and create something awesome. I'll do my best to respond to comments, and I'd love to hear about your favorite reversible knitting pattern. Also feel free to subscribe to my channel for more awesome reversible knitting. For those of you still here, the last few years I've been working hard to find simple ways to feel better, what I call my daily well-being practices. This is not medical advice, I'm just sharing what works for me. Today's well-being practice is deliberately building routines and habits. I find the key is to think logically about the routine so it makes sense and reinforces itself. There are many examples of this. For me, it makes sense to reset and deep clean the kitchen on Monday after a busy weekend. Laundry on Tuesday that includes tablecloths and kitchen towels. Wednesday I tidy and vacuum the crumbs and laundry fluff, and so on for the week. It's similar for habits in that I connect one habit to another. For example, exercising in the morning before I take a shower. Now, when I'm about to take a shower, I think about exercising and I can convince myself to work out for just 5 or 10 minutes. The more often I connect the two, the stronger the connection is in my brain. There are many detailed videos on effective ways to build routines and habits. They are easy to find. Have a great day.